Bruce Kelly sat on an overturned bucket, nervously fingering the edge of his gray prison robe. Opposite him, leaning against the metal cleaning supplies cabinet, stood Preston Clark. His dark warden's uniform almost blended into the shadows, his face showing tension even in the semi-darkness. "We need to be more careful," Preston said quietly, listening to the sounds outside the door. "Yesterday, Montgomery asked me where I disappeared to during my rounds." Bruce looked up, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "What did you tell him?" "That I was checking the West Wing." Preston rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "But he didn't seem like the type to take my word for it. Especially not me." Bruce stood up and walked over to Preston, gingerly touching his shoulder. Even that fleeting contact was risky. The prison walls had eyes and ears. "We could meet less often," Bruce suggested, though he struggled with each word. Preston shook his head. "No, I can't." He cut the sentence short when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Both of them froze. The footsteps passed by, dissolving into the hum of prison life. Preston exhaled and looked at his watch. "We have 5 minutes left. Then you need to get back to the cell block before the inspection." Bruce nodded. Their secret meetings were always calculated by the minute, like a complicated game of chess where every move could lead to disaster. 10 years, Bruce said quietly, pronouncing the length of time he had left before his release. 10 damned years. Preston hugged him, breaking every written and unwritten rule of the prison system. "We'll figure something out," he whispered. In those moments, Bruce often thought back to his old life, before prison, before the transition, before everything that had brought him to this cramped back room. Bruce Kelly was born Beatrice Kelly in one of Portland's poorest neighborhoods. From childhood, Beatrice felt trapped in someone else's body. At 14, she first recognized her gender identity. At 17, she began calling herself Bruce. Bruce ran away from home, surviving on the streets, scraping by on odd jobs. Intelligence and perseverance helped him get a scholarship to law school. He went on to become a lawyer. Life seemed to be getting better. A prestigious job in a law firm, his own apartment, the respect of his colleagues, most of whom did not even know about his past. But everything collapsed because of one fatal mistake. A major client of the firm, a real estate developer, bribed Bruce to forge documents for land that belonged to the city. Bruce agreed. He needed money for expensive sex change operations. The scheme unraveled. Bruce was arrested and sentenced to 15 years for grand fraud and forgery. 5 years he'd already served. 5 years of hell, where every day is a struggle for survival. A transsexual man in a men's prison is an easy target for ridicule and abuse. Bruce held on until Preston showed up. "What's on your mind?" Preston asked, interrupting his recollection. "About how we met," Bruce replied with a slight smile. Their story began a year ago when Preston was transferred to the cell block where Bruce was being held. First, there had been occasional glances, then casual conversations, then the first touch during a search that had taken their breath away. And for 6 months now, they'd risked everything for those rare moments alone. Preston Clark had come a long way too. He'd grown up in a family of hereditary prison guards. His father and grandfather had served in the correctional system. Preston was expected to do the same. He tried to rebel. He went to college, studied psychology, dreamed of becoming a social worker. But his father suffered a stroke. The family needed money, and Preston went down the beaten path, into the prison system. The first years of service were tough. He saw how the system breaks people, both inmates and guards, how the men in uniforms turn into sadists and the men in robes into mindless cattle. Preston clung to his humanity as best he could, trying to remain fair, not to succumb to prison callousness. His co-workers thought he was weak for it. His superiors didn't trust him. Prisoners saw him as easy prey. Before he met Bruce, Preston had seriously considered quitting. But there was something about this unusual prisoner that appealed to him. Intelligence, fortitude, the ability to maintain his dignity under the most humiliating conditions. "It's time," Preston said, looking at his watch. "Can you be at the library around 4 tomorrow?" Bruce nodded. "I'll try." Preston opened the door, checked the hallway, and nodded to Bruce. He slipped into the semi-dark passage and walked quickly to his block, and Preston, after waiting a couple minutes, headed in the opposite direction. The next day began for Preston with a headache. He slept poorly, tormented by nightmares in which he and Bruce had been exposed. He mechanically put on his uniform, ate a bland breakfast of coffee and toast, and went on duty. The day dragged on as usual. Inspections, rounds, minor skirmishes between prisoners, paperwork. Preston looked forward to 4 o'clock when he could see Bruce in the library, but at 3:30 his life took a sharp turn. Preston was returning from the mess hall after his lunch shift when he heard a quiet voice behind him. "Officer Clark, can I talk to you for a minute?" He turned around. Standing before him was Darius Temple, one of the most powerful inmates in the prison. A short, wiry man with a scar across his left cheek, known for his connections both inside and outside the prison. "What do you want, Temple?" Preston asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Darius looked around, made sure no one was around, and said with a wry grin, "You know, officer, we don't get much entertainment here in prison. Sometimes you have to watch the others to keep from getting bored." "What's your point?" Preston felt a chill run down his spine. "I saw you and Kelly, in the back." A fascinating sight, I have to admit. The blood rushed from Preston's face. He grabbed Darius by the collar and pushed him against the wall. "You're lying," he hissed. Darius didn't resist, only smiled. "Tuesday, around 5 in the evening, you were hugging. It was very touching. I can describe in detail if you like, or perhaps Warden Robinson would be more interested in hearing it." Preston let him go, realizing his mistake. Darius shook off his robe and continued as if nothing had happened. "Don't be so nervous, officer. I'm an understanding man. I can keep my mouth shut. For a price, of course." "How much?" Preston asked in a muffled voice. $10,000. In cash. For that kind of money, I'll forget everything I've ever seen." $10,000? Where would I get that kind of money? Darius shrugged. "That's your problem, officer. You have 3 days. If the money isn't there, Warden Robinson is going to get some very interesting information. And you know what? I don't think you're just going to get fired. You're going to be put in one of these cells. How's that sound?" With those words, Darius disappeared into the stream of prisoners, leaving Preston in a daze in the middle of the corridor. The library was one of the few relatively quiet places in the prison. It was quiet, smelling of books and dust, not sweat and fear. Bruce loved this place. It was a place where he could forget where he was, if only for a little while. Today he arrived early, took a tattered volume of Dickens from the shelf, and sat at the far table, pretending to read. In fact, he was waiting for Preston, reflecting on their last conversation and the crumbs of tenderness they'd snatched in their maddening situation. When Preston entered, Bruce knew immediately something was wrong. The warden's face was gray, his eyes running restlessly around. He walked over to the shelf next to Bruce, pretending to look for a book. "We've been exposed," Preston said quietly, not looking at Bruce. "What? By who?" Bruce continued to stare at the book, but the lines were blurring before his eyes. "Darius Temple demands $10,000 for his silence. I have 3 days." Bruce closed the book slowly, trying to cope with the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. "Do you have that kind of money?" he asked. Preston grinned bitterly. "How? I can barely make ends meet. My mom's sick. My meds are expensive. Hell, even if I sold my car, I wouldn't have that kind of money." "What are we gonna do?" "I don't know," Preston said honestly. "But I'll think of something, I promise." He paused, picked a book at random from the shelf, and added, "Meet me in the back tomorrow at the same time. I'll try to work something out." Bruce gave a barely perceptible nod, and Preston stepped away. For the rest of the day, Bruce couldn't concentrate on anything. His brain was feverishly calculating options, but none seemed realistic. Bruce knew what Darius was capable of. The man held half the prison in fear. If he decided to blackmail them, he wouldn't stop. The night passed without sleep. Bruce lay on the hard bunk, listening to the snores and groans of his cellmates, and thought about Preston, about the risks he was taking for their relationship. That if the truth came out, Preston would face more than just a dismissal. He could be convicted of having an affair with an inmate, and Bruce himself would likely be transferred to another prison, even worse than this one, or added time for immoral behavior. In the darkness of the cell, the future seemed bleak. Preston was awake too. He sat in the kitchen of his small apartment, bank statements, his mother's medical bills, loan agreements in front of him. The numbers were ruthless. He didn't have anywhere near the amount Darius was demanding. In desperation, he dialed the number of Elijah Clements, his only friend among the wardens. Elijah was on the night shift, but answered almost immediately. "Preston, what's wrong? It's 2 o'clock in the morning." "I'm sorry, buddy. I need to talk to you. It's an emergency. I'm on shift till 8 o'clock in the morning. Can you come to the north gate around 9 o'clock? We'll grab a coffee before your shift." "Yeah, thanks. See you in the morning." Preston hung up the phone and stared at the ceiling. Elijah was his last hope. Maybe he could borrow some of the money, or figure out how to deal with the blackmailer. In the morning, sleep-deprived and exhausted, Preston waited for his friend at the prison gate. Elijah showed up at 9 o'clock, tired from the night shift but ready to listen. They went into a small cafe across the street from the prison. The wardens often gathered here before or after their shifts. The place was cheap, the food was tolerable, and most importantly, they could talk relatively freely. Preston was silent for a while, not knowing where to begin. Elijah waited patiently. "I have a problem," Preston finally said. "Serious trouble." "I guess that," Elijah nodded. "I haven't seen you this depressed since your mother got sick." Preston took a deep breath. "I'm being blackmailed." "By who?" Elijah immediately tensed. "Darius Temple." Elijah whistled. "Really? And what does he have on you?" Preston hesitated. Elijah had been his friend for 5 years now. They'd started in the service together, had each other's backs in tough situations. If there was one person Preston could trust, it was Elijah. But what he was about to reveal could ruin even that friendship. "I'm meeting with one of the prisoners," Preston said quietly, staring into his cup. There was silence. Elijah froze with the cup halfway to his mouth. "You... what?" "You heard," Preston looked up. "I've been dating an inmate. For 6 months now." "Damn it, Preston." Elijah set the cup down with such force that the coffee spilled out onto the table. "Are you out of your mind? I mean, it's a crime, I know," Preston finished for him. "Believe me, I didn't plan it. It just, happened." "To who?" Elijah asked after a pause. "Bruce Kelly. That transgender guy?" Elijah shook his head. "God, Preston, I didn't even know that you liked men?" Preston grinned bitterly. "It was new to me too. But that's not the point. Darius saw us together and now he's demanding $10,000 for not talking. I have 3 days. Elijah leaned back in his chair, digesting the information. "Do you have that kind of money?" "Of course I don't. I've gone through all the options, sell the car, borrow, take out a loan. I can only get 5,000 or 6,000 and not in 3 days. "What if you pay part of it? Stall for time?" Preston shook his head. "You know Darius. He's not one to make concessions. If I don't bring the full amount, he'll go to Robinson." Elijah tapped his fingers on the table thoughtfully. "You know, I don't approve of what you're doing. It's crazy, and you're risking everything: job, freedom, future. But you're my friend, and I'm not giving up on you. We'll figure something out." "What?" I'm stumped. Elijah leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Look, maybe we should, deal with the blackmailers, once and for all." "What do you mean?" Preston tensed up. "You know what I mean. Darius is no saint. He's got a lot of enemies in prison, one more, one less. Nobody's gonna notice much." "Are you suggesting we kill him?" Preston said it so quietly that he almost didn't hear his own voice. "I'm suggesting we solve the problem," Elijah answered. "Think about it. You don't have many options, and remember, I'm with you, whatever you decide." After that conversation, they went their separate ways. Preston took his shift, performed his duties like an automaton, with one thought running through his mind. Was he really capable of murder? At 4 o'clock, Preston met Bruce in the back room as agreed. He looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes, probably hadn't slept either. "Did you think of anything?" Bruce asked instead of greeting. Preston shook his head. "I don't have any money, I don't have any." "So he's going to the warden?" "Looks like it." Preston sat down on the toolbox with his hands on his head. "I talked to Elijah." "You told him about us?" Bruce sounded worried. "Yes, he's my friend, the only one I can trust." "What did he say?" Preston looked up at Bruce. "He offered to, fix the problem. Forever." Bruce froze. "Are you talking about murder?" "Yes." The silence that filled the back room seemed palpable. Bruce slowly walked over to Preston and knelt down in front of him. "You're not a killer, Preston. You can't live with that." "And how will I live with it if the truth comes out?" "I'll go to jail, and you'll get added time or transferred to a federal prison somewhere where I'll never see you again." Bruce took his hands. "There's got to be another way." Preston straightened suddenly, a strange gleam in his eyes. "There is another option. We can escape together." "How?" "I can arrange your escape. I have access to duty rosters, keys to all the doors. I know where the blind spots are. We can take you out at night when most of the guards are asleep, and then I'll quit and go away with you. Mexico or someplace far away where no one will find us." "Are you serious?" Bruce couldn't believe his ears. "That's crazy. If we get caught, what do we have to lose?" Preston interrupted him. "If Darius tells, we still have everything to lose. At least this way we'll have a chance." There was hope in Bruce's eyes, faint but real. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to dream of a future outside these walls. When? He asked. It takes careful planning. It's not something that can be done in a day. But we don't have time. Darius won't wait. The night after tomorrow, I think. I'll check schedules, figure out a route. In the meantime, just be ready. They hugged tightly, desperately, like people with nothing to lose. The next day passed like a blur for Preston. He went about his duties automatically, studying duty plans, figuring out escape routes. In the evening, he met with Elijah again and talked about his plan. He was against it, considered the idea suicidal, but finally agreed to help. During dinner, Darius approached Preston. He smiled his crooked smile, as if he already knew that there would be no money. "Well, officer, have you collected my money?" "I need more time," Preston replied. "Tomorrow. I'll bring everything tomorrow." Darius shook his head. "Don't try to stall, officer. Tomorrow is the last day. If the money isn't there, I'm going to the warden." With these words, he left, and Preston stood there, clenching his fists with impotent rage. That evening, Preston and Elijah sat in Preston's apartment, discussing a plan of action. On the table were schematics of the prison, duty schedules, maps of the neighborhood. "Do you understand what we're going to do?" Elijah asked, looking at his friend. "This isn't just a dismissal. This is a prison, probably for life. We're going to kill 3 people and organize a prisoner escape." "I know," Preston replied quietly, "but I don't have a choice. And then it's not just a prisoner. This is the man I love." Elijah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good, I'm with you. But we need to think this through." They sat up late into the night, working out a plan. They needed to kill not only Darius, but also his cellmates, Marcus and Tyrone. The 3 of them had always stuck together, and if they killed only Darius, the others could guess who had done it and tell about Preston's connection to Bruce. The plan was simple. At night, when most of the wardens were on rounds in the other blocks, Preston and Elijah would infiltrate the blackmailer's cell and eliminate all 3. Preston will then lead Bruce out of his cell on the pretense of a night shift in the laundry room and lead him to the agreed-upon escape point, a section of fence in the blind area of the cells. Bruce will climb over the fence and be free. Preston will go back on duty, and then he will write a letter of resignation and leave for Bruce, who will be waiting for him at the agreed-upon location in the suburbs. "What if we're spotted?" Elijah asked. "Then we'll have to improvise," Preston replied. "But we won't have another chance." That night, Preston slept peacefully for the first time in days. The decision was made. The plan was made. Tomorrow their lives would change forever, for better or worse, but it was no longer possible to stay in limbo. Night descended on the Portland prison with a heavy black blanket. Rain drummed on the metal roof, creating a monotonous noise that drowned out other sounds. Preston Clark stood at the service entrance, smoking his 3rd cigarette in a row. His hands were shaking, his heart pounding somewhere in his throat. Elijah was due in 10 minutes. Preston checked his watch. It was 11:45. Most of the prisoners were asleep at that time, and the wardens on duty usually gathered in the recreation room on the 1st floor, where they could drink coffee and watch late-night TV shows. The block where Darius and his accomplices were being held was now patrolled by only one guard, a newcomer, Jerome Foster, who usually made his rounds in 5 minutes and then went back to his booth and dozed off until morning. "Nervous?" Elijah's voice made Preston wince. "Damn, you scared me." Preston put out his cigarette against the wall. "Yeah, nervous. Did you bring it?" Elijah nodded silently and held out the bag. Inside were 2 homemade shivs and a coil of rope. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Elijah asked, looking at his friend carefully. "It's not too late to retreat." Preston shook his head. "No, there's no choice. Darius has already hinted that he's going to see the warden tomorrow. Besides, we've got it all planned out. Bruce is waiting." Elijah took a deep breath and nodded. "Good, let's go then." They went inside through the service entrance. Preston showed his pass to the desk clerk, calling out a name from the night shift list when he asked what they were doing out so late. The guard, clearly tired and indifferent to everything, waved his hand without even looking at the roster. The corridors of the prison seemed like an endless maze at night. The dim lamps created bizarre shadows, and the sound of the rain, which penetrated even through the thick walls, added a surreal touch. Preston and Elijah walked at a brisk pace, trying not to attract attention. Every time another guard appeared from around the corner, they pretended to discuss business matters. Finally, they reached D Block, where Darius's cell was located. As expected, Jerome Foster had finished his rounds and was sitting in his booth, staring at his phone. "Hey, Jerome," Preston called out to him. "We're here for Temple." The inspector ordered him to be brought in for a talk. Jerome raised his head, blinking in surprise. "Now? In the middle of the night? You want to argue with the inspector?" Elijah intervened. "He's in a bad mood over there. They've got something on Temple's gang and they want to nail him while the heat's on." Jerome shrugged and reached for his keys. "Okay, I'll come with you." "No need," Preston said quickly. "We'll be fine. You'd better stay here in case any more of the bosses show up." Jerome was obviously pleased at this turn of events. He handed Preston the keys to the cell. "You better get back here quick, or I'll get in trouble." "Sure," Preston nodded, clutching the keys in his sweaty palm. They headed toward Darius's cell. Preston's heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it would wake the whole prison. Elijah walked beside him, outwardly calm, but Preston could see the tension in his shoulders. Cell number 143 was at the end of the hallway. Preston quietly inserted the key into the lock and turned it slowly. The door opened with a slight creak. It was dark inside, with only a faint light coming through a small barred window in the ceiling. 3 figures lay on the bunks deep in slumber. They stepped inside, quietly closing the door behind them. Elijah pulled a shiv from his pocket and nodded to Preston. The plan was simple. Preston was to strangle Darius with a rope while he slept, and Elijah would take care of his cellmates. Preston walked over to Darius's bunk, feeling everything inside shrinking with horror and self-loathing. He'd never thought he'd become a killer, but now there was no choice. It was either them or him and Bruce. He carefully unwound the rope, trying it on, and that's when Darius's eyes snapped open. "What the hell?" he said hoarsely, instantly recognizing the situation. What happened next was like a nightmare. Preston lunged at Darius, trying to throw the rope around his neck. He wriggled like a snake, trying to throw off his attacker. The noise woke Marcus and Tyrone. Elijah rushed toward them, waving his shiv. The chamber filled with the sounds of fighting, wheezing, punching, cursing. Marcus, a large man with a scarred face, grabbed a metal tray and swung it at Elijah. He rebounded, and the tray smashed into the wall with a clatter. "Hurry!" Elijah shouted, dodging Marcus's new attack. Preston finally managed to slip the noose around Darius's neck and tightened it. The blackmailer's eyes bulged, and he wheezed and clawed at the rope with his fingers, trying to loosen the tension. But Preston held tight, putting all his rage, fear, and desperation into it. Darius's face began to turn blue, and his movements grew weaker and weaker. Elijah, meanwhile, was fighting the other 2 prisoners. Tyrone, nimble and quick despite his small stature, had managed to snatch the shiv from Elijah's hand and was now attacking. He had already managed to slash the warden's arm, and now the sleeve of his uniform was soaked with blood. "Behind you!" shouted Preston, seeing Marcus sneaking up on Elijah from behind with a piece of rebar broken from the bunk. Elijah turned around sharply and kicked Marcus in the stomach. The man bent in half but managed to grab Elijah's leg and drop him to the floor. At that moment, Tyrone rushed forward with a shiv. Preston, making sure Darius was no longer moving, let go of the rope and rushed to his friend's aid. He grabbed Tyrone's hand with the shiv and slammed his head against the metal frame of the bunk with force. There was a muffled crunch, and Tyrone collapsed. Marcus, seeing that he was alone against 2 men, tried to scream, but Elijah managed to get his hand over his mouth. A desperate struggle ensued. Preston grabbed a second shiv from his bag and plunged it into Marcus's throat. There was dead silence in the cell, broken only by the heavy breathing of Preston and Elijah. The 3 bodies lay in unnatural positions, blood spilling over the floor. "God, what we've done," Preston whispered, looking at his blood-covered hands. "What we had to do," Elijah answered, wiping his face with his sleeve. "We need to get out of here, quickly." They hastily cleaned themselves up, wiping their faces and hands. Preston disguised the blood on his clothes by buttoning his uniform jacket to his throat. Elijah had a replacement shirt with him in his bag. He'd foreseen possible difficulties. When they left the cell, they locked the door and handed the keys back to Jerome, who didn't even look up from his phone. "That was fast," was all he said. "The inspector changed his mind," Elijah said. "He decided to postpone it until morning." They walked away quickly, trying not to attract attention. The plan called for them to split up now. Elijah was to leave the prison unnoticed, and Preston was to continue with the second part of the plan, getting Bruce out. "Good luck," Elijah said goodbye, squeezing his friend's shoulder. "I'll see you in the morning," as agreed. Preston nodded, unable to say a word. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving him empty and shaking. But there was no stopping. He headed for B block, where Bruce was being held. Bruce Kelly hadn't slept. He had spent the entire evening mentally preparing to escape. When footsteps were heard in the hallway, Bruce tensed. A moment later, the cell door opened quietly and Preston appeared. The warden's face was pale, his gaze intense. "Wake up, Kelly," he said loudly for the warden on floor duty. "You're being called to work in the laundry room. Avril's on the night shift." Bruce rose slowly, pretending he had just woken up. He picked up the stash bundle and slipped it discreetly under his robe. His cellmates continued to sleep, or pretend to sleep. No one wanted to mess with the wardens in the middle of the night. When they left the cell, Bruce walked ahead of Preston, as the rules dictated. They passed several corridors in silence. Only when they came to a deserted passage leading to the laundry room did Preston finally speak. "Everything's ready," he said quietly. "Elijah helped me with Darius and his friends. They're no longer a problem." Bruce froze, turning to Preston. "Did you kill them?" he asked just as quietly. Preston nodded, avoiding his gaze. "We didn't have a choice. Now listen carefully. We will now go through the service corridor to the east wall. There's a section there that the cameras can't see, between the two floodlights. The fence there is only 3 meters high. There is no barbed wire on top. It was removed for repairs a week ago, but the work has not started. And the guards? No one's there right now. A patrol passed 15 minutes ago. The next one will be there in 40 minutes. I'll watch from the nearest tower. It's unoccupied. If anything goes wrong, I'll signal with my flashlight 3 short flashes." Bruce listened intently, absorbing every word. His freedom and perhaps his life depended on this plan. "And then?" he asked. "If I climb over the fence, where do I go?" 100 meters from the fence, the forest begins. Run there and keep heading east. In 2 kilometers, there's a highway. There, in an abandoned bus stop, I left my backpack with clothes, money, and documents. Forged? Yeah, it cost me most of my savings, but it's good. You can make it to Mexico. I'll be there in 2 days. Meet you in Tijuana at the Blue Lagoon Motel. You got it? Yes, Bruce nodded. And you? What happens to you when the bodies are found? Preston shrugged. Hopefully they won't link it to us right away. I'll go back to my post, work my shift as usual. Tomorrow, I'll write a letter of resignation, tell her my mother's gotten worse and I need to move in with her. And then I'll just disappear. They walked to the service door. Preston pulled out a key and opened it. Beyond the door was a dark hallway leading to the east wall. "You'll go on alone from here," Preston said. "I'll go up to the tower, wait for my signal 1 long flashlight light when the way is clear." Bruce suddenly threw his arms around Preston, clinging tightly to him. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Preston allowed himself to hug him back for a moment, then gently pulled away. "Go, there's not much time." Bruce nodded and disappeared into the darkness of the hallway. Preston stood looking after him for a few seconds, then locked the door and headed for the stairs leading to the tower. The prison seemed a different world at night. The silence, occasionally broken by the sound of the rain and distant voices, pressed on his ears. The walls, which by day seemed simply gray and featureless, took on an ominous hue at night. Every shadow could hide danger, every sound could mean failure. Bruce moved down the corridor, trying to keep his footsteps as quiet as possible. His heart was pounding like crazy, his mouth dry. Only the thought of freedom, the thought that in a few minutes he might be outside these walls, gave him strength. The corridor led directly to the eastern wall. Soon Bruce saw a door ahead, leading to the street. He opened it cautiously and peered out. It was dark outside, and the rain had picked up. That was good. Less chance of being spotted. He saw a tower to his left, and a moment later, flashlight light flashed from there. 1 long signal. The path was clear. Bruce took a deep breath and slipped outside. Cold air and rain hit his face. After the musty atmosphere of the prison, it was like a breath of fresh water for someone dying of thirst. Bruce stood still for a moment, savoring the sensation, then moved along the wall toward the area Preston had indicated. Soon he saw it, the section of fence between the 2 floodlights, where there really wasn't any barbed wire at the top. Bruce looked around. There was no one around. There was no alarm signal either. He walked over to the fence and began to climb. The wet metal slid beneath his fingers. The rain drenched his eyes. But Bruce climbed up, driven by a desperate desire for freedom. Just a little more. Just a little more. He had already reached the top when suddenly the bright light of a searchlight flashed, blinding him. A shout came from somewhere on the side. "Stop! I'll shoot!" Bruce looked back in panic at the tower where Preston was supposed to be. A flashlight flashed desperately from there, 3 short flashes. Danger, but it was too late. The spotlight illuminated Bruce as if in the palm of his hand. He saw 2 guards running toward the fence with machine guns drawn. One of them raised his weapon. "Stop! Last warning!" he shouted. Bruce knew that if he stopped now, he would never get out of the prison. He made one last effort and threw his leg over the top of the fence, and that's when the shots rang out. The first bullet hit him in the shoulder, searing pain through his entire body. The second bullet hit him in the side. Bruce felt himself being swept off the fence. He fell for an infinitely long time, and the last thing he saw was the bright light of a searchlight in the dark sky where the rain clouds were running. He fell to the wet ground with a thud. Pain flooded his entire being, but strangely was no longer so sharp. Bruce could feel the heat spreading through his body, his own blood. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't listen. So close, he thought. Freedom was so close, just a few meters away. Another second, and he would have been running toward the forest, toward a new life, to Preston's. The guards ran up to him, one of them flipping him roughly onto his back. Bruce coughed, feeling the taste of blood in his mouth. "Shit, that's Kelly from B Block," one of the guards said. "What the fuck is he doing here?" "I have no idea," said the other. "Call the medics and the brass, although I don't think the medics will be needed." Bruce looked up at the sky. Rain fell on his face, mixing with the blood. He thought about Preston, about how he was feeling right now, seeing all this from the tower. He wanted to tell him that he didn't blame him, that he was still grateful for trying, but he couldn't say a word. Gradually, the pain receded, replaced by coldness and a strange calmness. Everything swam in front of his eyes, and the sounds grew muffled. Bruce closed his eyes, and the darkness swallowed him up. Preston could see everything from the tower. He panicked when an unscheduled patrol suddenly appeared. 2 guards who shouldn't have been in this sector. He signaled desperately to Bruce, but he was already starting to climb the fence. And then the shots rang out. Preston froze, unable to believe what was happening. He saw Bruce fall, saw the guards run up. He wanted to rush over there, to help, to save him, but he knew it was pointless. He'd be stopped, arrested, and then he wouldn't be able to help anyone, including Bruce, if he was still alive. Struggling to make himself move, Preston climbed down from the tower. His legs shook, and there was an emptiness in his chest that threatened to swallow him whole. He walked mechanically through the corridors, not realizing where he was going or why. He woke up only in the very back room where he and Bruce had met so many times. He closed the door from the inside and sat down on an overturned bucket. Only then did tears spurt from his eyes. He cried silently, shuddering with his whole body, crying for Bruce, for his unfulfilled dreams of freedom, for their future together, which now would never be. Crying for himself, for what he had become, a murderer, an accomplice to escape, a man whose life had been destroyed in one night. He didn't know how much time he'd spent there. The world outside the back room ceased to exist. But suddenly there was a quiet knock on the door, and he heard Elijah's voice. "Preston, are you in there? Open up." Preston struggled to get up and open the door. Elijah slipped inside and locked the door behind him. One look at Preston's face told him everything. "It didn't work out?" he asked quietly. Preston shook his head, unable to speak. He was killed," he finally said. Elijah sighed heavily and put a hand on his friend's shoulder. "I'm sorry. I really am." They were silent for a moment. Then Elijah said, "There was a commotion. They found bodies in Darius's cell. Robinson was furious and called everyone in for questioning. I was questioned too, but I said I was on duty all night in the south wing." "On the tower," Preston said in a muffled voice. "East sector. That's too bad. They'll definitely notice you've been gone for a while. And if they connect it to Kelly's escape..." "What's the difference?" Preston interrupted him. "Bruce is gone. I don't care what happens next." Elijah grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him. "Wake up. You killed 3 people. You helped a prisoner escape. If you get caught, it's life. You want to spend the rest of your life in a cage? Is that what Bruce would want?" Preston remained silent, staring at the floor. "Listen," Elijah continued more gently. "We have a plan. The provisional patrol will return to their unit in an hour. You need to go back to the tower as if you'd been there the whole time. If they ask why you didn't report your escape, say you dozed off and only woke up to gunfire. They'll punish you, maybe even fire you, but this isn't prison." "And the bodies?" Preston asked. "They'll find prints, evidence." "We wore gloves," The shivs are homemade. There's hundreds of them in the prison. And the cells in that hallway have been out of commission for a month. Budget cuts, no one to repair them. If we stay calm, we can get out of this. Prisoner squabbles like this happen all the time. Preston finally looked up at his friend. Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me? I got you involved in a murder, in this nightmare. Elijah smiled sadly. Because you're my friend. Because I know what it's like to love someone who can't be loved by the rules of this world. He fell silent, clearly not wanting to pursue the subject. So you're with me? He asked after a pause. You'll go back to your post, stick to the plan? Preston nodded slowly. Not because he wanted to save himself. He didn't care what happened to him now. But he couldn't let Elijah down again. All right, Elijah nodded. Then go. And remember, you didn't see anything, you don't know anything. You were just on duty at your post. Preston rose mechanically and headed for the door. Before he went out, he turned around. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything. Elijah only nodded, and Preston stepped out into the hallway. He walked without feeling his body, without noticing his surroundings. There was only emptiness and coldness inside. When he reached the tower, he went upstairs and sat down at his post. From here, he could see the area where Bruce had been killed. The body had already been taken away, but there was a dark stain on the ground that was being blurred by the rain. Preston stared at the stain as if it were the last link between him and Bruce. Somewhere down below, people were bustling about, commands blaring, the flashing beacons of a medical car. The whole prison was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. 2 emergencies in one night, a triple murder and an escape attempt. That hadn't happened here in years. But to Preston, it was as if it was happening behind thick glass. Sounds were muffled, images blurred. All that was real was that dark spot on the ground and the emptiness inside. He sat like that for the rest of his shift, mechanically checking in on the radio when required. No one came to check on him, everyone was busy investigating. At 7 o'clock in the morning, he was replaced by another warden who threw him a parting glance. Did you hear that? Kelly and B Block tried to escape during the night, shot him just outside the fence. Preston nodded, not trusting his voice. He went downstairs and headed for the exit. As he passed the medical block, he saw a body in a black bag being carried out. He knew whose body it was. His legs stopped on their own, and he watched Bruce being carried away. "Clark!" a voice called out to him. "The warden wants to see you, now." Preston turned around. One of the assistant wardens, Warren Griffin, stood in front of him with a tense face. "Warden?" Preston asked, trying to keep his voice normal. "Now?" "Yes, now," Griffin replied impatiently. "With the incident in cell 143 and Kelly's escape, the entire staff is under interrogation. It's your turn." Preston silently followed the assistant chief. He was surprisingly calm inside. There was no fear. What could they do to him that would be worse than what had already happened? Prison? After tonight, the difference between being on either side of the bars seemed insignificant. The office of the warden, Luther Robinson, was in the administration wing. It was a large room with large windows overlooking the prison yard. Robinson himself, a tall, heavy-set man with a military bearing, sat behind a massive desk piled high with files and papers. "Sit down, Clark," he ordered, pointing to the chair across from him. "I have a few questions for you." Preston sat down, trying to keep a steady, calm demeanor. "Yes, sir." "You were on duty this night at the East Tower, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And what did you see?" Preston thought for a moment. The plan was simple, to say he dozed off and was only awakened by gunshots. But suddenly he realized he didn't want to lie, not about Bruce. It seemed wrong, the ultimate betrayal. "I saw prisoner Kelly trying to climb over the fence," he answered. "And how he was shot." Robinson frowned. "And you didn't sound the alarm, why?" "Yeah, I didn't have time," Preston answered, improvising. "It all happened too fast." Robinson tapped his fingers on the table. "How do you think Kelly got there? Somebody had to let him out of his cell, take him through the prison." "I don't know, sir." Preston endured the warden's hard stare. "All I saw was him trying to climb over the fence." "You know what's interesting, Clark?" Robinson leaned forward. "Kelly was a lawyer before prison. Smart guy, but not too physical. All of a sudden, he's trying to escape on his own, unaided? Weird, don't you think?" "Not for me to judge, sir." "What's even stranger," continued Robinson, ignoring the answer, "is that on the same night there is a triple murder in Darius Temple's cell. Such a coincidence, isn't it?" Preston remained silent. Robinson scrutinized his face. "You look lousy, Clark. Didn't get much sleep?" A long shift, sir. Or maybe a guilty conscience. Robinson's tone has changed drastically. Look, Clark, I'm not an idiot. Nothing happens in my prison without me knowing about it. I know about you and Kelly. Preston flinched. He hadn't expected such a direct accusation. I don't know what you're talking about, sir. He tried to remain calm, but his voice treacherously shook. Come on, Clark. I have eyes and ears within these walls. You met in the back room in the library, a few times a week. Preston's heart dropped. If the warden knew all along, why didn't he say anything? Why didn't he arrest them sooner? If you knew, why didn't you do anything about it? He asked. Robinson leaned back in his chair, his face taking on something resembling a human expression for the first time during the conversation. Because you were a good warden, Clark. Strict but fair. The inmates respected you. You didn't abuse your power. There aren't many like you, and Kelly, he was no trouble either. Kept a low profile, helped out in the library. I didn't care what you did in your spare time, as long as it didn't affect the order of the prison. He paused, then added, but murder and organizing an escape is different. You can't prove I did it, Preston said quietly. I already have. Robinson pulled several sheets of paper from the stack of papers on the desk. Here's the expert report. They found your hair on the rope used to strangle Temple. And on Kelly's clothes, they found traces of your DNA. So much for simple work contacts. He slid the sheets over to Preston. He didn't even look at them. What now? He asked. Arrest me? Robinson looked at Preston carefully. That's what's weird, Clark. I've been arresting people for 30 years. I've seen guilty people who were afraid, begging, threatening, trying to get away with it. And you're sitting in front of me like a man who doesn't care anymore. Like you're already dead. Preston was silent. Robinson was right. Something inside him had died that night, along with Bruce. You know what I think? Robinson continued. I think Temple blackmailed you, threatened to expose your relationship, so you decided to take him out, and then help Kelly escape. The plan backfired, Kelly was shot, and now you don't care what happens to you. Preston looked up at his boss. If you know everything, why are we having this conversation? Arrest me and be done with it. Robinson stood up abruptly and walked to the window. He stared out into the yard for a long time, then turned to Preston. You know, I've been in this system for 40 years, and this is what I've learned. It doesn't fix anybody. It just breaks them, breaks prisoners, breaks guards, turns people into animals or machines. He went back to his desk and stacked his papers. I could have arrested you. You should have. But what good would that do? Another broken life, another lost soul. He walked over to the shredder in the corner of the room and began feeding it sheets one by one. What are you doing? Preston asked, confused. Giving you a chance, Robinson answered without turning around. A chance that Kelly didn't have. The official story is that Temple and his friends were killed in a gang war. Kelly tried to escape on his own, possibly because of threats from other inmates. Patrol spotted him and had to open fire after warnings. All clear, all according to protocol. He finished shredding the paperwork and turned to Preston. And you, Clark, you're going to walk out of here now, write your letter of resignation, and never come back to this town again. You're going to go far away and start a new life. And maybe one day you'll find a way to atone for what you've done. Preston stared at the warden, unable to believe his ears. Why? Was all he could ask. Why are you doing this? Robinson sighed. Because I too was once young and foolish. And I too loved someone I wasn't supposed to love by the rules of this world. Only I was luckier than you. He walked to the door and opened it. Go, Clark, and don't make me regret my decision. Preston rose slowly. His legs could barely hold him up and his head was buzzing. He took a few steps toward the door, then turned around. Thank you, he said quietly. Robinson nodded. Goodbye, Clark. And remember, your second life begins today. Don't waste it.